In the late summer of 1939, the United States Army was smaller than that of Portugal. Its soldiers practiced maneuvers with wooden poles labeled rifles and trucks bearing tank signs, while the nation's consciousness was shuttered behind the thick, rusted iron of isolationism. On the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the air was stale with the lingering scent of the Great Depression, a decade-long malaise that had convinced the world that the American experiment was flickering toward a dim, quiet exhaustion. Yet within 5 years, this same nation would be launching a fleet of ships so vast they would physically alter the tides of the English Channel, and its factories would be pulsing with a mechanical heartbeat that outproduced the rest of the world combined. The global order was not merely shifting, it was being disassembled and reforged in a furnace of American steel. The stability of the 1930s was a fragile illusion built on the memory of the Great War. Washington sat in a self-imposed exile, watching from across the Atlantic as the old empires of Europe, Britain, France, and the rising German Reich prepared to bleed one another dry. The American public, haunted by the ghosts of the Meuse-Argonne, clung to the Neutrality Acts as if they were holy scripture. Beneath this surface of stoic detachment, however, the American industrial machine lay like a hibernating predator. The infrastructure was cracked, the workforce was idle, and the political will was fractured between those who saw the coming storm and those who believed the ocean was a moat wide enough to stop any lightning bolt. The breaking point arrived not with a declaration, but with a sudden, searing silence over the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, the old world's assumptions about distance and safety evaporated in the smoke of the burning Pacific Fleet. The destabilization was absolute. In 24 hours, the United States was stripped of its choice. It was no longer a spectator of history, but its primary engine. The transition was violent and total. The government began to seize the levers of the private economy with a speed that bordered on the revolutionary. Car assembly lines were ripped out to make way for fuselage jigs, and the quiet, dusty towns of the Midwest were suddenly illuminated by the 24-hour glow of munitions plants. As the war escalated, the internal pressures of a democracy under total mobilization began to groan. The recovery was not a smooth upward curve, but a frantic, expensive scramble. The cost of victory was ballooning into figures that defied the comprehension of the era's best economists. Reform was no longer a political debate, it was a logistical necessity. To fuel the front lines, the state had to penetrate every facet of civilian life, from the rationing of sugar to the massive migration of millions of workers to the arsenal of democracy on the West Coast. The resistance was quiet but persistent. Strikes in the coal mines, the friction of racial integration in the defense plants, and the terrifying realization that the nation was spending its future to secure its present. The ideological struggle reached its peak as the tides of battle turned. In the humid rooms of the Bretton Woods Conference and the secret labs of the Manhattan Project, a new conflict emerged: the pragmatism of survival versus the ambition of global hegemony. The architects of this new era were no longer just generals, but bankers and physicists who realized that the war's end would not return to the old ways. They were building a world where the dollar would replace gold and American physics would replace European diplomacy. By 1945, as the Red Army closed in on Berlin and American B-29s turned the skies over Tokyo into a furnace, the United States stood at the precipice of a victory that was as terrifying as it was complete. The old empires were bankrupt, their cities were rubble, and their influence was a memory. The world was vacant, waiting for a master. The transition from a continental power to a global hegemon was finalized not on a battlefield, but in the sterile, high-ceilinged rooms of Potsdam and the pressurized cabins of the Enola Gay. As the summer of 1945 deepened, the internal struggle between American idealism and the cold pragmatism of the atomic age reached its breaking point. The Truman administration inherited a machine of war so vast it could no longer be dismantled without collapsing the global economy. The old European colonial powers, once the arbiters of the planet, were now supplicants, their currencies tethered to the dollar and their security dependent on the American nuclear umbrella. The arsenal of democracy had transformed into the Garrison State, and the quiet isolationism of 1939 was buried under the weight of a permanent military-industrial complex. The final realization of this new reality arrived with the blinding flash over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was the ultimate historical paradox. The United States had fought a war to end tyranny, only to emerge as the sole possessor of a weapon that could end civilization itself. The shift was irreversible. As the smoke cleared, the American flag flew over occupied capitals from Berlin to Tokyo, and the United States found itself holding the reins of a planetary order it had never intended to govern. The war had not just made America a superpower, it had fundamentally altered the American soul, shifting it from a nation that looked inward to one that would, for the next century, be defined by its inability to look away from the world. The transition from a continental power to a global hegemon was finalized not on a battlefield, but in the sterile, high-ceilinged rooms of Potsdam and the pressurized cabins of the Enola Gay. As the summer of 1945 deepened, the internal struggle between American idealism and the cold pragmatism of the atomic age reached its breaking point. The Truman administration inherited a machine of war so vast it could no longer be dismantled without collapsing the global economy. The old European colonial powers, once the arbiters of the planet, were now supplicants, their currencies tethered to the dollar, and their security dependent on the American nuclear umbrella. The arsenal of democracy had transformed into the Garrison State, and the quiet isolationism of 1939 was buried under the weight of a permanent military-industrial complex. The final realization of this new reality arrived with the blinding flash over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was the ultimate historical paradox. The United States had fought a war to end tyranny, only to emerge as the sole possessor of a weapon that could end civilization itself. The shift was irreversible. As the smoke cleared, the American flag flew over occupied capitals from Berlin to Tokyo, and the United States found itself holding the reins of a planetary order it had never intended to govern. The war had not just made America a superpower, it had fundamentally altered the American soul, shifting it from a nation that looked inward to one that would, for the next century, be defined by its inability to look away from the world. The silence that followed the surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri was not the silence of a world returning to peace, but the quiet hum of a machine that could no longer be switched off. The transition was complete. The United States had entered the conflict as a reluctant creditor and emerged as the world's central bank, its primary manufacturer, and its ultimate arbiter. The old maps of the 19th century were folded away, replaced by a new geography of influence defined by air routes, carrier groups, and the invisible reach of the dollar. The hidden promise of the war's beginning had been fulfilled. In saving the world from collapse, America had become the only entity capable of holding it together. Yet, as the soldiers returned to a landscape of sudden, glittering prosperity, the cost of this new identity began to settle into the national consciousness. The empire was no longer an ocean away. It was a permanent commitment, a heavy mantle that required a constant state of readiness and an end to the private, disconnected life of the pre-war republic. The United States had gained the world, but in doing so, it had lost the luxury of the periphery. It was now the center of everything, forever tethered to the crises of distant lands, a superpower forged in fire and destined to carry the torch and the burden of a global order that it alone could sustain. The final transformation was not found in the celebration of the streets, but in the quiet, permanent shift of the American landscape itself. The sprawling suburbs, the interstate highways, and the soaring skyscrapers were the physical manifestations of a wealth so absolute it felt like a law of nature. Yet, beneath this veneer of suburban peace lay the foundation of a global sentinel. The nation had traded its historic isolation for a permanent seat at the head of the table, a position that demanded an endless cycle of intervention, a massive standing military, and the heavy weight of a nuclear conscience. The American identity had been fundamentally rewritten. It was no longer defined by what it could avoid, but by what it was now forced to manage. As the 1940s closed, the United States stood as a colossus, its shadow stretching across every ocean and into every capital. The central question of how the war transformed the nation found its answer in the very air the world breathed, an atmosphere of American influence, American credit, and American power. The struggle had ended, but the era of the superpower had only just begun. The journey from a struggling, divided republic to the architect of the modern world was complete, leaving behind a legacy that would dictate the course of human history for the next century, ensuring that while the war was over, the responsibility of the victor would never truly end. The paradox was final. The United States had dismantled the old empires, only to become something far more reaching than any of them. It had sought to save the world, and in doing so, it had inherited it. As the sun set on the ruins of the old world, it rose on an American century, a period of unprecedented prosperity and terrifying responsibility, where the heartbeat of a single nation would henceforth dictate the rhythm of the entire globe. The war had not merely ended an era, it had birthed a titan that could never again return to the quiet of its own shores.